Are we ready?
5, 4, 3, 2.
Thank you. It is now 4:01. Now is the time set for the regular meeting of the Arizona State Schools for the Deaf and the Blind Board meeting. We have a call to order. Sukay, do you have the roll?
I do. Brittany Buchanan,
She is not here yet.
Lynn Davison,
Present.
Linda Bobe,
Linda will not be attending.
Mike Gordon,
Present.
Dean Howard,
I understand Dean will not be attending either.
P.V. Jan,
We understand PV's on his way. He's still en route from Phoenix.
okay, Aaron Wonder,
Present.
myself, Sukay Neisel, and David Nigro.
Present, so that makes 5. So we do have a quorum. If anyone on the phone, it's okay if you happen to drop off or have to drop off, let us know because we'll lose quorum, so we need to know. We can move on to, Brittany is now joining us. So we can move on to 1.02. 1.02, call to the public, no problem. Call to the public for agendized items. Letitia, did we have any in-person submissions? No, okay, and there were no electronic submissions either. So we can move on to 1.03, information item, summary of the ACDH's Task Force Language Acquisition, Dr. Kendra Benedict and Dr. Jennifer Scarborough.
Hello. Instead of Dr. Kendra Benedict, she unfortunately was not able to attend the meeting tonight, but we do have Michael Olivier, who was also a part of the task force along with the both of us. So he'll be joining me tonight. Thank you for allowing us to summarize our experience and our involvement in this task force. So good evening, board members, Superintendent Reichman, Assistant Superintendent Martin, and Assistant Superintendent Cooper. I'm learning your new sign name. Thank you for your time and for the opportunity to share about the task force focusing on language acquisition. This task force started gathering data approximately in February or March of this year, and we worked diligently until our final report was submitted in June. The task force was comprised of members from different representatives from different fields around the state. ASDB had 3 representing members. So that would be Dr. Kendra Benedict, myself, as well as Michael Olivier. Michael currently is involved with our Curriculum Resource Department, or the ODD. At the time that he joined the task force, he was joining as the supervisor of the preschool department, and that would be at the campus of PDSD. The 3 of us participated. However, we also had many ASDB staff members who were involved in this task force. However, their representation in the different subcommittees was as volunteers. So they were representing community members. As you read through the report, you will see their names and you will see them as ASDB staff. However, in this capacity, they were representing representing the community members because they are subject matter experts who happen to work at ASDB. So we had both skills represented, ASDB specific membership that was represented as well as the community. ASDB did have strong representation within this task force. So the three subcommittees that I briefly mentioned were data and demographics, systematic connections, and third, assessments review. Today, we're going to briefly discuss the recommendations of those three subcommittees. Those recommendations are to be presented to the public. We have received input and feedback from the community, and then they will be proposed to the legislature. The legislature is currently deciding what to do with those recommendations. I'll get to the recommendations from the first subcommittee, Data and Demographics. They had 10 recommendations, but primarily their recommendations were to focus on the validity and reliability of data. We want to look at data from students around the state, as well as the importance of identifying those students and having a way to track their data. There are many agencies that work with these students around the state, and their identifier within database programs varies between agencies. We came to the realization that there is simply no centralized place of repository for this data. So that was one of the primary recommendations to the legislature. They also wanted agencies to begin sharing data. It's also important to have continuous tracking for these students from birth until the age of 21, to be able to ensure that these students are acquiring language throughout the spectrum. So that was the recommendations, primarily from Data and Demographics. Next, the findings from the systematic connections. There were 3 primary recommendations. This group focused a lot on medical professionals, such as audiologists, and making sure that those groups are sharing impartial, non-biased information to families, to parents and guardians of these children. Making sure that these professionals are providing all language approaches and technology options. Another recommendation is making sure that upon identification of for example, the failure of a newborn hearing screening, that families are provided immediately with all resources available. And that staff are provided screening and that they are able to be trained systematically so that they're providing similar information for families across the state. With that said, these agencies that work with children across the state need to improve partnerships ongoing and work in collaboration with one another. As children reach transition age, those transitions should be more seamless and efficient. And information needs to be accessible for all families, which ties back into that need for a centralized repository for data, which was one of the findings of the data subcommittee. Once that information is accessible, it should be accessible to the public. So that is why everyone needs to have access to whether our children are achieving the intended outcomes. Are our children thriving? Are they acquiring language? Or are we hiding that information? Right now, that information is not easily accessible. The final subcommittee was the assessment subcommittee. And so I'd like to have Michael come and give some details on those recommendations.
Good evening. I'm happy to talk about the assessment subcommittee, but first I do have to express my pride in how many ASDB staff members were involved in these subcommittees. They showed a great deal of commitment in their areas of expertise and to the benefit of our students. The assessment subcommittee had a variety of individuals involved. In the first part, we were looking at what assessments were available out there, and there is a wide variety of assessments available. Depending on the agency or the group, the preference of assessment varied. So we really needed to whittle down which assessments we were going to use. There are too many assessment tools to just leave it open to the provider's discretion. We focused first on birth to 5 and what assessments are being used for that group, and then separately from ages 5 to 21. We needed to look at both ASL assessments as well as spoken language assessments for students who are using spoken language. We narrowed that down and we recommended a total of 7 assessments. And 7 recommendations, and I'll summarize those briefly. The first is to establish a statewide assessment team that will provide all of the assessments across the state. And of course, this is going to necessitate legislative funding in order to establish this program. And they have asked that ASDB take the lead on this. So we don't want it to be a school by school or a case by case basis on what assessments are being used and how that's being done. We want it to be systematic. We also want to make sure that we have a qualified assessor to administer the assessments for both spoken and sign languages. For our birth to 5 children, we recommend they be assessed twice a year, and 5 to 21 be assessed once a year. As Jennifer mentioned earlier, we also want to make sure that all of the information is available publicly. Of course, redacted appropriately so that names and identifying information is not available, but overall we'd like to see how our children are progressing, and that information should be available for the public to view. We want that assessment data to be centralized. We want the assessment training and qualification process to be centralized as well to make sure that those assessments are being done appropriately. So that's a summary of the assessment group's recommendations, and I will let Jennifer close us up.
As you may have noticed, the recommendations from those 3 subcommittees did develop somewhat in isolation. However, they are not all unique. There is a lot of overlap, which is nice to see that at the end result of all our work, we are seeing a lot of parallels. And so we are seeing a lot of the same things within this field. The experts have seen some commonalities, some common needs, and we have come to an agreement about a lot of these items. It was really nice to have that common sense of agreement. There was not a lot of disagreement. The experience overall was a wonderful experience, and at the end, while it, yes, was a lot of work looking back, these recommendations are something that we feel strongly about and that we are satisfied with. We're very happy to be a part of this experience, regardless of the amount of work involved. So now I'd like to open it up to any questions that anyone on the board may have.
Are there any questions? No? Seeing none, thank you so much for your work and the work of the other ASDB staff. Is very useful information, I think, for the board and for things the agency may do in the future. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is 1.04 information item, superintendent's report. Superintendent Reichman.
Good evening. President Nigro, members of the ASDB Board of Directors, Assistant Superintendent Martin, Assistant Superintendent Cooper, and the ASDB community. Welcome to our September 8th, 2022 board meeting. I am thrilled that we are meeting in person. I know we've done several meetings in person already, but this one feels different to be in person. So I will start off with my report, but first a short story. And this short story starts a long time ago in a village under a glass dome. And this village had been there for a long time. Many generations had lived there. People were born there, grew up there, married there, had children there, and died there. They didn't know what it was like outside of the glass dome. They assumed that if they left the glass dome, that they would die a terrible death. So they had a law that said, if you seriously break the law, then one possible punishment would be to be thrown out of the glass dome and perish. Fortunately, for many generations, nobody did any serious law-breaking activities until one day, one man severely broke the law, and the community decided to throw him out of the glass dome. They expected that man to die. So the village people were curious to see what happened to him, and they all headed over to the glass window and looked out and watched the man. That man, as he was laying on the ground, and began to look around. He was afraid. He thought he was going to die at any moment. But he laid there, looking around, and nothing was happening. So he started to move. He got up, stretched his arms and legs, walked around. He could feel the grass, and still nothing was happening. There was no danger there. So he started to dance. And then he looked over to the villagers and said, "Come out of the glass dome, come join me and dance with me." The village people were appalled. They were shocked, dismayed. How is this possible? They couldn't believe their eyes. So they met and they talked and made a decision. They went and got some black paints and then started to paint on the glass dome. And they painted moving up and up and up until they could no longer see the man. And then they went back to their lives, their everyday routines. Now that man, his violation was what, you may think? He was an innovator. How does that story apply to ASDB? Well, it applies to us. Last summer, in August, we were looking forward to coming back to a sense of normalcy. Back to school, back to normal, back to itinerant services, back to normal. Early intervention, back to normal. We believed that we were starting school, the students would be back, the teachers would be back in the classroom, itinerant teachers back into public schools, working with teachers, and our early intervention teachers going into the homes, working with parents. Instead of using Zoom, we would be back to normal, back to life pre-COVID. We really believe that. And then, time has passed and we're slowly realizing that we are not back to pre-COVID life. Our students are coming back to school and their lives have been disrupted for more than 2 years. So think about their experiences. Not knowing if tomorrow they were going to school or staying home, having to use Zoom, trying to get an education remotely, thinking maybe next week we'll go back to school in person. Their routines were disrupted. We found out that our students' social emotional growth was compromised, was disrupted. And that is not just us. And this is true of students in every school across the nation. Students are returning to school not remembering how to behave, expectations of appropriate behavior. They haven't learned appropriate behaviors. So we are having to address their social and emotional growth before we can address the classroom learning. That is one thing that has changed. The second change is it has become harder to recruit qualified teachers, professional staff, and staff. And it's not just us. This is a nationwide problem. Other schools are having challenges finding qualified teachers and professional staff. It just so happens that Arizona is the 4th worst in the country with vacancies. We at ASDB have more than 110 vacancies in our agency. And we are learning that those gaps in our professional staff are starting to affect our students. Our ability to provide the best educational support to all of our students. That's the second change that's happening. The third is our enrollment of students on both campuses continue to decline. The number of students we have in our schools is less than before, and we have to make some decisions. That's another conversation for another day. But I did want to let you know that there will be some critical decisions that we have to make looking at our student enrollment numbers. The fourth thing that has happened this year is we are right now going through a sunset audit. If you recall, Arizona has a law that requires all state agencies to go through a sunset audit every 10 years. The last one was 2012, which means this year we went through the 2022 audit. We started last spring. The Arizona Auditor General's, or the AG, contacted us, or the Auditor General contacted us with a list of questions, and we collected the information and provided it to them, and have been working with the Auditor General ever since. Last week, we just got the preliminary report from the Auditor General, and we are now reviewing the report. Now, what's within that report is still confidential because it is a draft. It is not a final report. So I wanted to let you know that this information within that report aligns with our strategic plan. So it will have impacts on our strategic plan and the agency's plan for the future. And I will talk about that more later. In the strategic plan, President Nigro asked us to provide an update on our work with the strategic plan. I have asked Assistant Superintendent Martin and Assistant Superintendent Cooper to provide that update. But I do want to say that, first of all, when we looked at our AZ merit scores from last year, you may recall that not only are our students behind that come to our school, they come to our school because they're behind. And then the additional disruption from the pandemic caused an even more significant delay. And we are seeing regression with our students. Again, that is consistent with what we're seeing across the nation. Second thing I'd like to mention is we used to collect data for students we served in the public school. Up until 2018, Arizona Department of Education provided us with that data for students that we serve through our regional cooperatives. In 2018, the Arizona Department of Education informed us that they would no longer be providing us with those AZ merit scores for those itinerant students. That data belonged to the school district. It did not belong to ASDB, to ADE. We have not been collecting information from the school district, and we started doing that recently. So Assistant Superintendent Martin will be commenting on that. A lot of changes have been happening in our environment that will have an impact on our plan for the future. Now, I want to wrap up with one final thought. Our agency leaders wrote a letter to you, and they gave it to me. They asked me to share some of their thoughts with you. In that letter, they talked about the importance of collaboration. They work every day collaborating with students, with parents, with school districts, with the community, stakeholders. They do that every day, and they recognize the importance of the collaboration with you, the board of directors. They also recognize that if we collaborate, that has to be based on common trust, mutual respect, and collegiality, excuse the interpreter. It is very important to do that, to have those, and then be able to collaborate. So with all the environmental changes that were happening and changes happening within the agency, it becomes even more so important for you, the board of directors, to support our work, to support our leaders. They do have 2 recommendations for you, the board of directors. One recommendation is to establish a training on cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and on accessibility, how to run a board meeting that is more accessible to all board members. Those are the 2 recommendations that they wanted to share with you. So that wraps up my report to the board, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions for the superintendent? Superintendent, my question relates to the data that we used to get from the co-ops. As you mentioned, as late as 2018, we used to get that. We don't anymore because ADE won't give it to us. I know that when we talked about the LEA transition a few years ago, we thought we could amend the IGAs to get that data from the school districts. Is there a plan to amend those IGAs to get the data going forward and retroactively so we can establish a couple of baseline years for our strategic plan purposes?
This is Superintendent Reichman. I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Superintendent Martin to respond to that question.
Thank you, Superintendent Reichman. President Nigro, governing board members, thank you, as well as superintendency as community. So I heard that ask loud and clear in our last board meeting about the need for data. We came around the table with Jay Johnson. Him and I talked about, how could we track this data down? We talked about several avenues. One was going directly to ADE to request that data. We did go down that road and were met with a staunch no. So we looked at how we could make this happen. And I'm going to bring Jay Johnson up in a little bit, but we reached out to districts. So we've got a couple of things going on. One was the start of the school year. 2 was we have data that is not allowed to be released just yet until after the embargo date by the state, which is sometime, I'm believing, in September. Mm-hmm. So we were able to collect quite a bit of data. We had a very good response from districts. And I believe after we get past this embargo date, districts will be a little bit more inclined to release that data. The regional directors were out on the pavement. They were instrumental in getting that collected. So a lot of work has been done. The goal was to see, my directive I gave to Jay is, let's make this happen before the September 8th board meeting. And he took that challenge and ran with it. So we collected quite a bit. The goal is, once we get past this, districts are typically used to sharing student records, student information. They, again, overwhelmingly, they shared, and that was shocking to me this time of the year. So I'm going to let Jay Johnson come up and talk about the work that he did with his directors in the regions and what that looks like.
Good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. President Nigro, board members, Superintendent Reichman, Assistant Superintendents Cooper and Martin. It's always a pleasure to come before the board to talk about the great work that we're doing in the itinerant program. Before I get to the data that our regional directors and myself have been able to work with our school districts and charters out there, I did want to share a positive note from one of our audiologists that sent an email early this morning about 6:30 in the morning because he gets up quite early. And the email was stated, "Good morning. It's pretty amazing to see the many elements of progress that are presented tonight at the board meeting regarding itinerant services. I just wanted to say thank you. It's nice to see not only a voice to the representation of the work that is being accomplished in the itinerant programs, but also the need for the data to be brought forward to this team." So I wanted to mention that to you, that they're keeping an eye on the work that we're doing. I do want to mimic what the superintendent and associate superintendent mentioned. In a recent email from ADE, they stated and confirmed that the state testing data for students that we serve in the itinerant program is the home school district's data, not ASDB's data. Each separate school district can share or not share that data as they deem fit. So that was a challenge that was already thrown in front of the directors and I to really look at how can we make sure to build partnerships with our school districts and charters throughout the state. Currently, we have about 201 school districts and charters, LEAs, in the state that we currently work with. As of today, 101 have responded to our request for state-level data on the students that we serve in the grades 3, 8, and 10. This process all started, as Associate Superintendent Martin suggested, on Saturday, July 23rd. We started really working with those schools to get information out. We started emailing and contacting all of our special education directors that following Monday on the 25th of July, and our request was to receive the data by August 12th. So we'd have time to put that together for our board report for tonight. Finding about the embargo date that we're unable to release any of that student data we currently possess, but we'll be adding additional data as the semester moves along. The regional directors and I worked together on a shared spreadsheet to collect the data that we wanted to have answered, the questions from all districts. We also met weekly to discuss the challenges and brainstorm how to collect the assessment data. We've been documenting our attempts, including the following information: which district has responded, the contact person title, the date, the time, and the mode of contact we've had, whether it's in person, by phone, or email, and of course the outcomes of the data that we've been able to collect so far. The goals that we shared with our LEAs, number one, was that we wanted to collect the student achievement data and the goal to use the data to drive our continuous improvement in services with the partnerships of all of our districts and charters. We also wanted to share with them, we wanted to outline what the data we're looking for in the terms of the 3 grade levels and the students impacted. And last, we wanted to share with them, to the districts who did not respond, to remind them of the importance of the data, and of course contacting the special ed directors and reminding them how we can build that partnership moving forward. This timeline, of course, was at the beginning of the academic year, as we all know, just started. At the beginning of the school year, many of our districts were overwhelmed with getting their own staff started, additional students on their campuses, and now that the school year is underway, we plan to reach out to the LEAs again who have not replied to us at this point. We plan to personally reach out to those districts and explain the need and how they can assist us with that data. All along, there have been challenges that have been in front of the regional directors and myself as we can move forward with this work. The first challenge was, of course, the timing of the request posed the greatest challenge, and it was right at the beginning of the academic year. Many of our LEAs had staffing shortages, hiring, new students enrolling, and day-to-day tasks that they were doing. The LEAs simply did not have the time or the capacity to gather the data needed. Another challenge we found was that various contacts within the LEA in the terms of who collects that state assessment data And sometimes our special education directors did not have access to the data in their own districts or charters, but then referenced additional staff members that we were connected to for those data specialists. In some instances, they were guarded with the data. We have a few districts in our state that are waiting for the embargo date before they'll release it to us. And they also didn't feel it fell between the partnership of services as part of the ASDB itinerant programs. Some LEAs see the itinerant program as a need-to-know partner for this information. So again, we're going to continue to work together as a team, meet weekly as we already have, to make sure we brainstorm how to collect additional data on the remaining about 100 districts out there that we have not heard from. Are there any questions relative to this work?
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I know trying to coordinate with a couple hundred school districts on this must be very difficult, and I understand there's going to be some complications. You mentioned that you have data from about 101 of them. If you need anything from the board, if you need us to amend an IGA, if you need us to take some other action, please bring it to the board, and we'll consider it. It's important that we get that data. And again, if it's not here today, that's okay, but I want to be sure that we're working towards getting as much as we can. In terms of the children that we serve between 5 and 22, there are 354 on the campuses. There's 108 in the itinerants. So it's the vast majority of the students that we serve that are school age or above preschool. And we need to know how we're doing. That's why we put it in the strategic plan. I think if we had realized, we would have addressed it a little bit earlier had we realized that we were no longer getting this data. I think when we made the strategic plan, we're like, well, we saw this data before, so we thought it was still there. But in any event, if we can keep working on that, anything that you guys need that from the board, please bring it to us at the next meeting, and we'll certainly consider it.
We'll be happy to do that. Thank you for the offer.
Thank you. All right. Are there any other questions for Superintendent Reichman?
Gordon. Annette, you mentioned in the end of your report about trainings about board meetings and accessibility. Could you reiterate that a bit and just explain how that would work or what the plan is for that, please?
So if you all recall, at the July board meeting, at the end, Linda Bove recommended to the board, and I think the leadership team at ASDB caught that recommendation, that you all be involved with some sort of training that focuses on cultural awareness and sensitivity, and also focuses on accessibility and how to be more sensitive to access and to make sure that everyone has equal access, and it is designed, and we design the meetings in such a way so that all participants have equitable access and participation within each meeting. There are those types of trainings out there, and we also internally have those kinds of trainings. We have deaf awareness, orientations. We just talked about developing a blind awareness orientation. So we internally within the agency are trying to figure out how we and our staff can become more aware and more sensitive and more equitable, and how we interact with each other. So that is what I meant by that comment.
Okay, thank you. Also in your report, you mentioned that there's going to be Braille literacy classes that will be offered to families. What kind of participation are you anticipating, or have you heard so far?
I am not sure of that information. That is a training that we do provide to parents, or we will be providing to parents. But the best person to answer that question would be Lisa Yancarelli. Lisa?
So we have had a request for Braille literacy classes for our families, and so we are working on developing that. A survey will be going out in the next few days to survey families on the best format for that class, whether people are available to do the class in person or whether we need to offer it virtually. We will be contracting with Dr. Penny Rosenblum to teach the class. She has taught the class in previous years for our agency. So I'm not sure the level of interest that we will have, but we will conduct them this semester. It will start October 13th. And whether that's in person or virtually, it depends again on the response from parents. And then we will look at doing another offering in the spring semester and grow from there. So the course will offer basic Braille, the basic Braille code, but then also some literacy strategies and how to make, for example, story boxes to go along with literature, how to encourage your child to use Braille, things you can do to increase literacy within your home.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There any other questions for the superintendent? Thank you. And Superintendent Rickman, that accessibility is going to extend to the forms that we present for the board meetings, that will make sure that they're accessible? I know in the forms that we have, on some of the documentation that we have today, I'm looking at it now, don't necessarily have graphical descriptions in every graphic and things like that to make it accessible to screen readers.
President Nigro, I'm not sure I understand your point.
My point is, if we're going to be talking about accessibility, we should make our documents accessible to those that use screen readers to access PDF documents and other documents, electronic documents.
Are you speaking of board materials?
Yes, board materials.
I think currently our agenda is in Braille, and then the other documents are attachments with it, to the agenda. They are attached to the agenda. So they are PDF format. They're PDF documents. So if we're discussing accessibility, I would have to do more research, honestly. I'm not aware of the accessibility of PDF format. I don't know at this time.
Yeah, there are some tagging here. You can run an accessibility report, which I just did. Some of the graphics that we have in some of these reports don't have alternative text, which, again, if we're going to be talking about accessibility, we need to make sure that everything we put up here is going to be accessible if that's going to become an issue.
All right. I will follow up on that.
All right. Thank you. We can move on to 1.05, Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum Instruction, Superintendent Martin.
To give you, President Nigro, Board, an update, one of the things I think Superintendent Reichman threw out is how we would look at using this AZ merit data and how that will drive schools. Where we're at is COVID. You look at any school that's dysfunctional, it's the culture that's the heart of that dysfunction. COVID has did a number on culture, and that culture disconnects teaching and learning, and it's a tremendous impact across schools. So there's a lot that we're looking at doing in the schools. We have a lot of data points we'll be unraveling. AZ merit data will be used to validate the interventions and the things that we've tried throughout the year. We will be using data throughout the year, benchmarks, performance-based data, MTSS, SEL data, social emotional learning data. So there are a lot of points of data that we have to collect, as well as some other changes that we'll be doing instructionally inside of the classroom. Right now, we're, with the principals and I, we've got a lot on the table. We're looking at framework. We're looking at a lot of different things, and that will bring in a lot of different data points. So this will be, throughout the year, something that we will have to try, tweak, try. We'll go back between research and practical base, back and forth. So we'll use this AZ merit data as a way to validate its post at that point, how we did throughout the year. And that will inform the focus of our changes of going into the next year and things that we will further tweak. So that is something that once we have schools and positions that are filled, we have a lot of things now that are in holding patterns because we just do not have the people power to get some of these programs off the ground. So one of the first things that the principals ask is that we start with our portrait of a graduate. And this is what we want our students to look like when they walk out of the door. Then we'll plan backwards as to how to make that happen. So we'll look at installing grit, making sure they know how to work hard, and we'll also look at installing agency. Agency in the standpoint of students have to be able to know how to ask for the help that they need. That agency will also be in the community as well, and as well as we have to have places, opportunities for these kids to go once they leave here. Otherwise, we're teaching them to work hard just to be tired. So there has to be some type of opportunity. So we'll use a lot of data points to look at and reimagine where we are culturally. So a lot of what we have to address is we have to reconnect teaching and learning. We have to reestablish that culture. But a lot of it right now is we have a lot of other work to do and positions to fill. So, questions?
Are there any questions for Assistant Superintendent Martin?
PV. Hi, this is, thank you, President Nigro. This is PV Jans. I do have a question for Assistant Superintendent Martin. I noticed in your report that you mentioned the sunset audit, discussing a draft report, and I understand that report has been delayed after meeting with the auditor, and it seems that ASDB has to submit a response to the auditor had to submit by September 1st, but I don't see that document. Is that response to the sunset auditor going to be submitted to the board for review, or where can we see that?
Those are two separate things. So we had to respond to the JLBC by September 1st, which we did. They had some questions that were kind of above and beyond what the sunset auditor has. The deadline for applying to the draft audit has not yet passed. That's going to be, I believe it's next week.
And this is PV Jans. Okay, so where is ASDB's response? Will the board see that response at some point?
The response to the JLBC or the response to the Auditor General?
Both.
Superintendent Reichman has possession of the September 1st correspondence. I don't think there's any issue with her emailing it to the board. That's the response to the GLBC. The other response is not yet complete. I'm assuming that it'll be circulated when it is. The state auditor did request that Superintendent Reichman distribute the draft report to the board on a confidential basis. The information in it is still confidential at this point, so I'm sure she is ready to do that. We just got that email a few days ago.
Okay, I appreciate that update. Thank you. I just want to make sure that we are up to date with that process. My second question regarding AZ merit, I understand using data for making appropriate decisions regarding what is in the best interest and benefit to our students. I do just want to caution regarding the AZ merit. It is not normed for ESL students, and that includes our deaf students who use American Sign Language as their first language, and those who may have Spanish or other languages spoken in the home. And we do have students whose family are immigrant families and refugee families, and that has an even greater impact on those students. So I just want us to bear that in mind. If we are using AZ merit data, we may have an intention for, an intention for all of our students to be bilingual, and it is not necessarily fair or appropriate to consider their progress based only on that testing. All of our IEPs require that our students be bilingual, and if they're not bilingual, then they're not performing well, and that's not necessarily a fair assessment of our students and their skills and their intelligence. That's not necessarily a fair assessment of how ASDB is performing either. Realistically, how we approach the data, how we consider that, I'm wondering if there is any other assessment tool or evaluation tool that the board could recommend to the leadership team or the administrative team. For example, the DRP as one other possible assessment, another metric to monitor a student's progress without that sense of setting them up for failure.
Thank you for that, PV. Yes, I agree with you. It's a data point. It's something that when we tweak and go through this picture and develop our metrics, we should be able to see how our students are performing clearly. And if we do not have those right metrics in place all throughout the year, we should also be able to see that clearly as well. So at that point, when we get AZ merit data in, it's kind of like this is what we have, and is there any validity to it? Is there something that we can validate from that test data? With us, our picture is going to look a little bit different, so fully aware of that. But open to any ideas of any assessments, anything you recommend, I'm open to any resource. So thank you.
Thank you. This is Board Member Jantz. And my recommendation would be perhaps for the specific subject areas, we ask those teachers what they suggest as appropriate assessment of knowledge and skill. And we may also consider what Gallaudet or RIT, NTID use to assess some of their students' knowledge and skills, and see what we can glean from those institutions rather than reinventing the wheel. At the same time, that would give us more accurate data and testing that is more appropriately normed for ESL students. And that is one thing that I really do want us to keep in mind, is that all of our students that we are evaluating have IEPs. And that means that every single one of our students is going to have at least one disability. At least one disability that will impact their learning and their acquisition of language, whether they are deaf or blind, or deaf and blind, deaf plus other disabilities, blind with other disabilities, all of them will be impacted by that. And so our teachers are our experts. I would like to ask them how they measure our students and assess our students, and perhaps we can use additional tools that already exist, such as the DRP. I talked to my son recently, and he was frustrated because he said he gives up really quickly, and if he's frustrated with something, and so I wanted to talk to him about that. He sat down to take a test, and he couldn't understand the test, and he felt frustrated, and he gave up, and he said his peers feel the same way, and that test isn't an accurate representation of his skills or the progress that he's made. And I think that's a pretty common occurrence with our students. So how can we address that? So right now I just wanted to at least make sure that everyone's aware of that, and let's ask the right people in the right subject matter experts for their expertise.
So thank you. Great point. I have been working with NTID. We'll be coming around the table around research and around practices for our schools. The principals and I have a trip to Gallaudet to pick apart their schools. We are probably looking at November or the spring. We have to set that date. There are some other things in there that I haven't mentioned, but the goal is to learn, to glean, to pick apart. So our trip to Gallaudet is to visit their schools, to pick those schools apart. I've gotten Superintendent Reichman's okay and blessing to move forward with NTID. When I started, I reached out to NTID on a whim, and I was contacted back, and we would have conversations in the evening, email, sometimes phone on the weekends, and they have agreed to work with us. So a lot of what I'm looking at is there's a lot of people we have to bring around the table. Teachers are a huge part of that input that we'll get. And there's a lot that I will be recruiting teachers from the schools, from all different levels. So they're a huge part of that also. I think for me, I'm trying to look at this picture not from the inside, and we have to look at this differently. And so for me, I have been engaging with researchers about this issue of what do we need to do? What are our best what works? And it's a complicated picture. But so we will be engaging and bringing a lot around the table, as well as structures that we will put into the schools to make sure that our teaching and our teachers are supported, and the learning and teaching is happening with fidelity. So some of those things I won't speak on just yet. But this has been, for me, listening, learning, seeing, taking in data and input from just about everyone. And so I can kind of see the picture of where we are and where we need to go. I don't currently think we have an answer for what we have to tackle, and it is going to look differently. So I have challenged the principals to look at this picture differently, look at how we can reimagine and reinvent and recreate these schools. How can we make them go? So that is what we've been picking apart. And they have answered that call, and that call is usually on the weekends at 7 to 8 o'clock at night when I have an idea, and they respond. So that's to let you into some of that process. That's what I've been picking apart. Superintendent Reichman has been great. Also, I've been bouncing things off of her as a soundboard. So, schools are multi-layered. There's a lot of work that we need to do. But I've never approached any school thinking it cannot be done. So that's where we're at. But thank you.
President Nigro, thank you. This is Board Member Dance. Just one follow-up question. First of all, that's great news, Assistant Superintendent Martin. That's very positive thing to hear, the progress that you're making. One thing that I do want to recognize is how much I appreciate your willingness to take a back seat and to listen and to gather the information before we start jumping to conclusions or test action steps. I want to thank you for your willingness to listen to the staff that we have and the resources that we have to offer. I do want to acknowledge that and thank you for that. One area that I did want to mention for consideration is that when we talk about language acquisition, is there any discussion of testing or evaluations that can better assess not just the literacy, the English reading and writing for our students, but the spoken language acquisition and the American Sign Language acquisition, or the Braille literacy of our students?
Yes and no. Yes, where we have been is looking at, we have to get serious about our language programs in the schools. I think that will drive a lot. That's an area that we have to pick apart, dissect. This is a discussion we're having. This is not a discussion that we've got into very deeply, but it is a component that we have to work on, as well as looking at different ways to assess our kids, because again, Our kids learn differently, and we've got to be able to understand how they learn. Doesn't mean that they can't learn, and we have to be able to assess that. So, yes, that is an area that we will get into. I think right now there's so many other pressing things and big items. One is hiring. One is having the staff to start moving forward. And when we start to unfold this, that language piece is a huge piece of the schools, and the schools will look a little differently. But the goal is to equip them to do what they're here to do, and that's to impact teaching and learning. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. On a related note, but slightly tangential, I was wondering if there were any discussions being held or thoughts about student recruitment and or retention. For example, we have deaf kids who are acquiring language and doing well, who then transfer either out of state or to other schools, and they are not staying within our campuses. Is there anything that we're doing to retain those students to then be good language models for their peers at the campuses, rather than transferring out to other schools for the deaf who are offering students out-of-state services, for example? Are we competitive with other schools for the deaf across the nation who allow and recruit deaf students? How do we keep those students on our campuses? Is that a conversation that we're having?
Indirectly, meaning I think in order for us to be reestablished, we have to be known for being great at what we do. We have to lead by showing the community, not just local, but national, who we are. It is engaging people for NTID, for instance, to let them know what we're wanting to do and where we're wanting to go. So I've always had the philosophy of when you come over and take over a school, no one wants to go there because it's failing. But when you build it and you reimagine it, I've always had the problem of people wanting to get into the school. So I do believe that if you put a program together and you build the school, that kind of sells itself. Now, I'm not a great marketing person or salesperson. I do believe in what I do, and I do push the people around me to do better, not just for me, but for the students and community we serve. So my goal is to, how can we build this school? How can we reimagine this school to make it to where people actually want to come here, to where it is recognized on a different scale? So that's my goal going into it. So I have not had those direct conversations, but I know that I can't, at this point, promote anything the way we currently are. And this is not to say that we have a lot of dedicated educators. We have a lot of people who are here for the right reasons. I've met tremendous people who are hungry for wanting and ready for the change. And again, we go back to this cultural thing from COVID. So again, we build it, we do it well, and I think it speaks for itself. I've had schools where I've had waiting lists, and I've had people lobby districts to make that school a place where they can get into. So that's the work that I'm focused on doing right now. And I'm sure there's people better than me who can do the marketing part, but yeah, thank you.
Well, I think you did a phenomenal job just there of that marketing pitch. That's kind of what I was hoping you would say. And I am hoping that the community at large, as well as the board, will see and hear your comments that your ultimate goal is this concept of, if we build it, they will come. So we want to make sure that we have the right supports in place, the right beliefs, the right attitudes in place, that we need to build the system in order to have them come. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you. We can move on to 1.06, information item, Assistant Superintendent of Agency Operations and Support Services, Assistant Superintendent Cooper.
Good afternoon, Board President Nigro, Superintendent Reichman, Assistant Superintendent Martin, members of the board, the ASDB community, and staff members. Each of the directors have provided to you their departmental reports. There is no additional information that has come forth since those reports were provided to you last week. As Superintendent Reichman mentioned in our last boarding on July 7th, there was feedback that was received on the strategic plan pillar 4, effective resource management, and I wanted to go ahead and give an update on those items. More specifically, with the average cost per student by program, which is outcome measure 4.4.4. It was mentioned that the early program preschool cost may have not been included in a separate line item in the chart. I do want to confirm that the information is in the chart and the costs will be reported similarly as to how the spending by operational area report is provided on an annual basis. Also with outcome measure 4.4.6, which is our fiscal stability and efficiency, it was mentioned that there does not appear to be much progress on that report. That does appear to be true. However, based on a review of the information, a revision will be made to the chart to better display and communicate the goal of the metric. And so what that would include would be including priorities that we will be funding, what work has been done towards those improvements, and reporting how that money is received, as well as how it is going to be spent. Also in the strategic plan is objective 4.2, which is our long-range master facility plan. In order to provide a quick overview of that master facility plan work session that our Director of Operations, Albert Duff, will be conducting on October 20th, I would like to also lay that foundation by providing a high-level overview of our current reality and why the need for a master facility plan. A master facility plan actually establishes the framework for the orderly growth or the consolidation and development of our capital improvements on our campuses. And it will be developed in a 5-section document consisting of our educational programs, where we'll be reviewing what programs will be continued into the future, exploring those programs as Assistant Superintendent Martin has briefly talked about, in trying to ensure that we're better serving our student population. It will also address our current facilities, which should be in conjunction with our demographic study and our educational programs. We'll also be evaluating the potential buildings that may need to be renovated, demolished, as well as constructed for new buildings. Also, as I mentioned with the demographic study, we'll review the demographic study that our vendor, LaCroix, Milligan & Associates, did a couple of years ago. Reviewing that, looking at the enrollment trends, as Superintendent Reichman had also mentioned. And then also that fourth piece would be the actual implementation plan. And so we'll be working with an architectural design firm to help us build that infrastructure for renovating and demolishing the new construction. And then we'll also be working with various legislatures, looking at funding opportunities to help us with those support needs to get those resources. We'll then also make sure that we're evaluating those plans based on the initial planning process. This will involve the work with each of you. As board members, we'll be looking at establishing new policies and procedures and making sure that we're continuously improving that master facility plan. This will then also be shared, as we've briefly mentioned in prior board meetings, with the sunset audit. We have received an initial finding. We're working on that recommendation, addressing that, and that is specific to the master facility plan. And again, as I mentioned, our Director of Operations will be providing more information in that work study session. So all of that will align with our agency strategic plan. It's been quite some time that we've needed to evaluate that infrastructure, making sure that it's meeting the needs of our changing environment, and also looking at where we are underutilizing our facilities. Some of our programs are outdated, as Assistant Superintendent Martin also mentioned. So we'll be tying all of that together with our resources looking at the master facility plan, tying that into our educational programs as well. So I did want to mention, though, however, we do have different reporting requirements, different than how our school districts do. So it does put a strain on the agency's budget when we're looking at budget limitations, the capacity in terms of addressing how our departments are growing, looking at how we're causing inequities among the various services that we have, and looking at new potential and more successful educational programs. We have also, through various conversations, have talked about the lack of funding when it comes to the resources needed and how we are limited when it comes to that. One of the areas that we have not quite addressed within our budget development is the need to focus on deferred maintenance. Each year, we do, as part of our capital and building renewal, submit information to the state in terms of what renovations we're looking at doing, how those average and median age of our buildings are. Just specifically on the Tucson campus, the average is about 48 years, I believe. Just looking at that, the Phoenix campus, the average age of those buildings is 38. So ideally, we want to make sure that we're looking at improving our capital improvement processes, working with the legislature, just looking at various resources. I don't want to steal the thunder from Albert, but just wanted to at least provide that framework, get us thinking, be prepared for that meeting, which is scheduled for October 20th. And that actually concludes my report, and I'm open to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. I do note in your report, it says the agency received about $3.3 million for some capital improvements. Where did that come from?
That came from the state legislature in terms of our general fund operations that is derived from the capital improvement plan that I had briefly talked about.
Okay, great. And has the agency done any estimates as to what it would take to take the buildings on both campuses and restore them to, a useful life of one, let's say, if we're at a useful life of an average of 48 here and 38 on the Phoenix campus, about how much would that cost in total?
I will defer that. I can see Albert is actually coming to the stage. I'll have him specifically answer that question for you.
Board President Nigro, yes, actually we do have that information as well as our replacement value for those buildings as part of our insurance process as well. So all of that can be discussed, and it's pretty detailed, and I don't want to take up too much time, so that way we can discuss that in the work study session.
Right, but what's the number?
Off the top of my head, I'd have to go look, but it's well over $100+ million.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any questions for Ms. Cooper?
I do. This is Board Member Jantz. One thing I wanted to clarify, when we say the average age is 38 for the Phoenix campus, and then the Tucson campus, the average age is 48 years old. When was the last time that a new building was constructed on either campus?
Definitely before my time, however. Albert will be able to answer that.
Board Member PV, that would be 2007.
Okay, so 2007, that means that's at least 15 years to start. Do you know if there's any chance to even compare to a comparable school district? When do they typically build or renovate their buildings? How often do they recycle or refinish these buildings?
Typical recycle or refreshing programs are based on the individual aspect of the building. So, for example, roofs, plumbing systems, whether that be the shell structure, each have a different refresh period. So, for example, you typically want to refresh plumbing every 40 years, electrical every 15 to 20. So school districts tend to build that out in long-range planning. Long-range planning is something that we do internally and something we add to our capital and building renewal process. Specifically, what we're talking about here that's a little different is master facility planning, which is tying that directly to the educational programs, as we know that we have a big educational change need, as Assistant Superintendent Martin mentioned. So rather than just doing a typical refresh, we have to really kind of take a step back, look at it holistically, and ask, okay, what programs do we currently have now, as well as the ones that we want in the future, or ones that maybe need to be consolidated or changed, and then meet what I would say, put the cart before the horse in that aspect, of that we want to make sure that we put the horse in front of the cart, which is allow us to make sure that our educational programs drive our need for our facilities, rather than make our educational programs fit into the facilities we have now. So each one of those, going back to the original question though, you could see typically most of those schools would refresh about every 30 to 40 years to completely demolish and put in a new building. You definitely do not want to go past 50 years on a building for any life structure. You just see that becoming a dangerous point. As you can see, the average age of 48 years, as well as the median age for 48 years on the Tucson campus, we are at a critical juncture for that Tucson campus, and the Phoenix campus is closely approaching.
Okay. So you may not be able to answer this question, but who has the final authority to decide whether a building or institution needs to be demolished or renovated? Who has the ultimate authority to make that type of decision?
We are in cooperation with ADOA, and so we work with what's called the General Services Division. So the General Services Division would provide a recommendation for a building to be closed or demolished or potentially renovated, as they do in what's called their quadrennial. So every 4 years they do an inspection of the building, or are supposed to. In the 10 years I've been here, that has been one time that they've done that. So they're not as proficient as with that reporting aspect as they should be. They would provide information in that report based on each one of those core functions of the building, whether or not it is in disrepair, in need of repair or replacement, or at a point of condemning the building. They would make that determination. The only person who has the authority to close a building immediately due to safety reasons would be the state fire marshal. And the state fire marshal performs typically an annual inspection of the buildings for safety and life safety aspects, but their scope is fairly limited only to life safety and not necessarily general condition or what we would call quality of use within those buildings or the purpose of that building. So it's multifaceted, I would say. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it is up to actually us here in the room to make the final determination whether or not we want to demolish a building or request to build a new building. So we get to drive that discussion.
Okay. How many buildings on the Tucson campus and how many buildings are we looking at from the Phoenix campus that would be considered condemned or in need of significant repair?
That's something that we would go over in more detail during the master facility planning and work study session. As of right now, none of our buildings are condemned. We do have quite a few surplus buildings that would definitely need a lot of maintenance or repair in order to bring them up to a standard that I would say would be acceptable for occupancy, but none of our buildings are currently condemned.
Okay. So you had mentioned that responsibility really falls on everyone here in the room. And so that would include us as board members as well. My question is, where's the board been for the last 20, 30, 40 years? Because some of these buildings obviously are quite old, based on the comments that you've made. How did we get to this point?
I believe, and granted I wasn't here, so it's pure speculation at this point, the last major build happened in the early 1990s, which means that the information came from the 1980s demographics. With that in mind, that particular growth that we saw in the late 70s and early 80s drove the board as well as members within that group of leadership to make determinations to expand buildings. From that period of time on, we have seen a decrease after 1980 of our student population on both campuses. And so with that in mind, or shall I say the Tucson campus, because the Phoenix campus really didn't start until really about the mid-70s. So with that in mind, I would say that they thought it was one and done, and it just fell off of everyone's plate, and I do not know exactly why or how that became a problem for the board as well as leadership at the time. But I'd rather focus on today, and that we have some amazing experts here in the room. One of our contractors that we're working with is actually named John Dickinson. He actually builds and is an architect for deaf and blind schools. So he's someone that we will be partnering with during this process. So we have not only experts in the room, but also other contracted experts to help us. But as stated, it really does derive from and grow from the educational programs. And it's something that I'll point out here as a little prelude. Whenever the first campus moved in 1922 to the Tucson campus, there were 4 buildings built: a dormitory for the girls, a dormitory for the boys, an administration building, and a maintenance building. And I'm going to ask and see if anyone's willing to raise their hand. Of those 4 buildings, what's missing out of a school? A school.
Education?
So we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. So we will be going over the history of ASDB construction, shall I say, in our work study session. And that will help us strive to avoid those past mistakes and make sure that the education building and the needs of our students come first. And so I'm excited to work with Assistant Superintendent Martin on those education programs and supporting that with new buildings or renovations to our buildings. And I'm pretty sure, looking at what we had from our CIP meeting, our capital improvement plan meeting with ADOA, they are excited to partner with us on it as well, and will be actually lending a hand in the master facility planning process.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure that we all are understanding as a board the weight of that responsibility to recognize that the unfortunate reality on our campuses is that they have kind of gone under the radar for several years, and that it falls on us to look at the buildings that we have. And I do think that there is value in not looking for quick fixes. So I appreciate the time that we're dedicating to work together to figure out how we want to tackle this issue. Obviously, it's very complex and multi-layered. I'm looking forward to the work study session on the master facilities plan. Thank you.
Thank you. And I note that in the the mid-teens we had certainly more pressing issues with the superintendent selection and superintendent search. And after we did that, we have long known that facilities is an issue. In fact, it was a key part of the strategic plan. You'll note that no progress was made on that, primarily due to COVID. That was disrupted. So that's where we are today, at least how we got here in the last 6 or 7 years. But that doesn't negate the prior several decades of poor capital planning. Assistant Superintendent Cooper, we will need maybe 10 or 15 years of enrollment data for that work study session.
Yes.
That's probably, and then also the demographic data that you talked about. All right, so moving on, we're going to go to, actually it's 5:30. Oh, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I just want to this is Board Member Brittany. I just want to say, about the work study and the master facilities plan. I know that when I came down here for the last board meeting, I actually scheduled a tour. I live in Phoenix. I've never been down to this campus. That was my first time on campus. I set up a tour with Albert, and he kind of took me around, and I think it's really important if you are a board member here, upcoming, or anybody that's part of this decision making that we're going to move forward for, to please schedule a tour and actually get your boots on the ground and see what is going on in our school. I don't think that we can sit here in good conscience and look at paper and make decisions for families and students and people that are current here and our future without actually seeing what we're actually doing and where our money's actually going and where it should be going and where it shouldn't be going. So I'd really encourage everybody, especially here on the board, to schedule a tour, and Albert was super amazing. So I would just like to put that out there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Britt.
I would agree with that.
I'm sorry, this is Assistant Superintendent Cooper. Thank you for that, Brittany. I also did want to mention Albert did a tour with our OSPB budget analyst. What was that, maybe last week as well? So getting them to visibly see our infrastructure as well, to get them on the radar in terms of looking and having them aware that we are going to be submitting some funding issues as it pertains to the facility plan. So we are encouraging not only internal, as you mentioned with the board, but others as well as the external agencies. So building that network.
Amazing, thank you.
Thank you. It is 5:30, so we're going to take our break for the interpreters. We'll come back at 5:40.
You're only saying that because he's not here. Okay, thank you. Hopefully I won't have to speak anymore. Hopefully. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay. Yeah, that's the first time that's been said. Normally, like, maybe there's more people in there. Yeah. Okay. I couldn't hear. I think we may need to say something to those at the podium too, because I couldn't really hear Albert.
So Albert,
Yeah.
like boosting it, it's kind of like these 15 feet.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is true. This is, yeah. Mm-hmm. I think this is the first time in a long time to have some of the directors come up and speak. Yeah, so that is true. Yeah. Yeah.
Check, check. 1, 2, check, check.
You have to put this microphone.
Right.
See,
that's good, right? And here I'm like, oh, sure.
To bring it in on the.
Foundation on, a whole bunch of people. What's me here? You know.
Yeah, I'll bring it. It's a.
Thank you.
the meeting in just a few seconds. If everyone can return to their seats. You guys ready? Ready? Okay. We are back. We're moving on to 2.01, action item, approval of the consent agenda, consistent with board policy to include items 3.01, 3.04, 3.05, 4.02, 5.01, 6.01, 6.02, 7.01, and 7.02. Do we have a motion to accept the consent agenda?
This is PV Jans.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, President Nigro. I would like to make a motion that we remove agenda items. Excuse me, I lost my number just a moment. (6.01) and 6.02 from the consent agenda.
Okay, do we have a second for that? Okay, that is not seconded. I move that we accept the consent agenda. Is there a second?
I second.
All in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
And Suke, are you on the line? Suke? Okay, Suke, can you hear me? Suke?
I can.
Okay, thank you. Any opposed? And any abstentions?
This is PV Jans. I abstain.
Okay, great. Okay, we have the consent agenda is now passed. We're going to 3.02, action item, approval of new district agreements. Assistant Superintendent Martin.
We have 3 contracts for approval, one in each region. Mojave Accelerated Elementary in Region 1, in Bullhead City. Region 2, Basis Scottsdale. Region 3, Solomon Elementary District in Solomon, Arizona.
Thank you. I move that we accept these contracts. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions?
I'll abstain.
Thank you. Okay, we can go on to 3.03, action item, approval of 301 performance-based plan for school year 22-23. Assistant Superintendent Martin.
President Nigro, governing board members, if you have reference, if you have questions for that, but these are submitted to you for approval for the upcoming Prop 301 performance-based pay. Any questions? You have one for campuses, itinerant services.
Okay, are there any questions for Assistant Superintendent Martin? Okay, I move that we approve the 301 performance-based plan.
I second.
Okay, all in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? And any abstentions?
This is PV Jans. I abstain.
Okay, thank you. Next is 4.01, information item finance report. Kim Bittridge, Director of Business Services.
Good evening, Board President Nigro, Superintendent Reichman, Assistant Superintendent Cooper, and Assistant Superintendent Martin, members of the board, and ASDB community. Our most recent Financial Committee meeting was held last Thursday, September 1st, with Board Member Aaron Wonders present. Also in attendance was Superintendent Reichman and Assistant Superintendent Cooper. During the meeting, we discussed the budget submittal for fiscal year 2024, the June and July 2022 financial reports. Our budget request includes one funding issue of $2.7 million for additional funds for transportation, since the $1.1 million we received for fiscal year 2023 was one-time funding, and this is an ongoing cost to the agency. The full budget will be available on the website within the next day or two. Provided to each of you is the same financial data that was provided to the Finance Committee, but in a more condensed version. The total student count for August 1st, 2022 is 2,066, a decrease of 12 students when compared to the August 1st, 2021 count of 2,078. The major differences are a decrease in the regional cooperative students of 26, a decrease in the preschool students of 11, an increase in site-based students of 2, and an increase in birth to 3 of 23. As of August 1st, we had 480 FTE, which includes 8.5 FTE at FBC. At that time, we employed 693 employees. However, some of them are part-time. Most of them are part-time. There are currently 146 vacancies across the agency. The highlights of the June 2022 financial report are that we ended our revenues exceeding our expenditures by $4.2 million, while the fiscal year 2021 ended with a deficit of $1.1 million. Our revenues are $2 million under budget, and our expenditures are $4.3 million under budget at that time. However, previously incurred budget fiscal year 2022 revenues and expenditures will still be posted in fiscal year 2023. Our cash balance was $20.8 million compared to $12.9 million in June 2021. The main increase is in the regional cooperative funds of $3.8 million and the classroom site fund of $2.5 million. Historically, we will not receive any new voucher and fee-for-service revenues for the 2023 school year until later in September or October, so this cash balance helps us to meet our obligations in the first quarter of the fiscal year. I would also like to point out a few changes in the financial reporting. Blind programs were previously tracked under the Tucson campus, but to be consistent with deaf programs, we have moved them under the administrative statewide programs. In addition, Yuma was moved from Region 1 to Region 3, and the Region 1 preschoolers have been moved under the early learning program. Budget fiscal year 2023 reflects the draft budget of $67.8 million that will be updated to $68.1 million to align with the budget submittal to OSPD and JLBC. As with budget fiscal year 2022, we will not divest any of our funds from the trust fund since we have a cash balance of $224,000, and that will cover our current request for this fiscal year. The July 2022 and 2021 revenues and expenditures are relatively consistent. There is a decrease in other sources of revenue since we received surplus property funds in budget fiscal year 2021 for vehicles that were sold. The major difference in expenditures is an increase in equipment with the purchase of Chromebooks for the students of $326,000 using emergency connectivity grant funds in budget fiscal year 2023. If there are no questions, this concludes my report.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
This is PV Jantz. Thank you, President Nigro. Can you give us a bit more information about your sense of what kind of positions are currently vacant? 146 is obviously a significant number compared to the previous school year, so I'm wondering, are there specific areas that are vacant more so than others?
I believe there was 38 teachers and 18 instructional assistants, and and there were like 11 drivers and 50 other staff, classified staff.
PV, this is David, in the Assistant
It's also in the
Superintendent.
board report, yes.
Yeah, and the Assistant Superintendent Cooper's report, pages 12 through 16, has all of the classifications and all of the positions that are open. So if you can take a look at those, you can see that they're divided by Phoenix campus itinerant services and then divided by job classification.
Great, thank you so much. I wanted to make sure that the community was able to get that information as well. My concern, especially right now, is what efforts are being made for recruiting. Are we sort of waiting until the next school year to be able to try to fill those positions, particularly for assistant principal positions?
This is Assistant Superintendent Cooper. No, we are not waiting. We post those positions as they are needed. Per the request, we have a process where the staff are required to provide justification. We also have been looking at, as you may have heard, we've been looking at staffing in terms of aligning staffing with student ratios. We've talked about that quite a bit, but to answer your question specifically, we are not waiting to post those positions when the school year occurs. As soon as they're needed, they're justified, it works its way through the process, and we're beginning the recruitment. I'm sorry, this is Assistant Cooper. I also wanted to mention we are actively recruiting. We just hired a new HR recruiter within the Human Resources Division recently, and he is expected to start on Monday.
Are there any additional questions for Ms. Bittridge?
Thank you.
No, thank you. Next up, 703, information item, Ombudsperson presentation, Donna Williams.
Good afternoon, Board President Nydro, Board members, Superintendent Reichman, Assistant Superintendents Cooper and Martin, and the ASDB family. My name is Donna Williams, and I am the ASDB Ombudsperson. Thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about myself and my role as Ombudsperson. I have a short presentation to share. The Office of the Ombudsperson is really about collaboration. We heard Superintendent Reichman talk about the importance of collaboration, and so it is important in this role as well. When I started in July, it was important that I gather as much information about the agency and the people working in this agency to determine kind of the scope of this role and how I could be of service and of help to the agency. And so one of the things I did was set a lot of meetings. Took a lot of time and talked to a lot of people, and I'm grateful for the time that they spent with me sharing about this organization. Next slide, please. So the goal will be to facilitate positive relationships among staff, students, and the public, again through collaboration, ensuring fair processes, ensuring accurate information, and also helping to resolve concerns. And that is the main role of the Ombudsperson. Next slide, please. This slide just has a little bit about myself. Just to summarize, I am an attorney by practice. I've been an attorney for many, many years. In 2010, I decided to transform my practice into conflict resolution, and so I have been a practicing mediator since that time. I've had many roles where I have been problem solving for individuals, for agencies, for businesses, and so I bring that expertise with me. I'm also a contractor with the state in special education, conducting mediations with parents and teachers, trying to find needs for trying to meet the educational needs for students in the state of Arizona. So, what is an ombudsperson? So there are a number of things that I came up with the help of the leadership of the agency as well as Superintendent Reichman, and so I'll share some of those things. Sometimes the ombudsperson is just an active listener, right, an ear to bounce things off of. I can provide options for resolution, respond to questions about process, about policy, about who, what, when, where, why, and how, explaining those policies and procedures that may be misunderstood. I can also facilitate and mediate communications between individuals and groups. That is kind of the typical skill that a mediator brings to the process. I can also help find steps to resolve problems and help people talk through that resolution process. One of the important things that the ombudsperson also does is looks for trends in patterns, in problems and complaints, and then brings that information to the attention of the superintendent and of the board so that the appropriate discussions or actions can take place. So, next slide, please. The ombudsperson also, though, works within boundaries, right? So, as much as the role will assist both internal and external agency issues, there are some boundaries that the ombudsperson should stay within. So, one, the ombudsperson will not direct agency departments to change a decision or a policy. Again, the feedback from people that use the service, there may be some trends that bubble up that I share, but ultimately it's up to those departments and the agency to make whatever decisions they want to based on that data and that information. The ombudsperson will not offer legal advice, testify or produce documents in legal or other proceedings, conduct investigations. That responsibility will remain with Human Resources at the direction of the superintendent. The ombudsperson will not substitute for formal channels. So the agency already has extensive policies and processes to follow regarding complaints and grievances. And while people may utilize the services of the ombudsperson, doing so does not change those processes. And then I won't advocate or take sides or address personal disputes outside the agency. For example, if you're having problems with your significant other, your landlord, your neighbor, those will not be issues that the ombudsperson will address. Next slide. So the role of confidentiality in this process will be key to building this program and sustaining it. And so I want to take just a few minutes to talk about confidentiality. In dealing with the ombudsperson, we are going to, obviously I'm collecting information, but the information that will be shared from the office will be aggregated data that doesn't have personally identifying information. Issues obviously regarding safety and health issues as a mandatory reporter will obviously be shared, but outside of that, communications with the office will be confidential. And also, the ombudsperson will not communicate with attorneys or be involved in the matter once legal steps have been taken. And so the role of maintaining confidentiality belongs to everyone. And one of the ways that we do that, next slide please, is to safeguard the information that is received through the office. And so we have set up a number of processes where you would engage the ombudsperson, which I'll talk about later, but so that I'm really the only person that receives that information, it makes it easier for me to safeguard it. That means, though, that the person using the service also has to be responsible for safeguarding the information. And so if I'm keeping your information private and you're broadcasting it, that defeats the whole purpose of confidentiality. So it really is a two-way street. So again, as I stated before, the aggregated data that is gathered from the program will be shared with the superintendent and the board, just for the purpose of seeing how the services are being utilized, and then again, what trends or opportunities there are for larger discussions or changes in process and policy. And then finally, the next slide, please. The continuum of available services is really a chart that we came up with that really shows you kind of the range of opportunities to engage this office, starting with information being kind of the most general, moving into mediation being the most involved. And so if we look under information, as I stated before, provide information about policies and processes, share additional resources around problem solving and other concerns, serving as a neutral sounding board, right? So just someone that you can bounce ideas off of, and then again, providing that feedback to the superintendent and the board on the trends that I'm seeing. Moving on to navigation, which is helping users of the process understand and navigate the policies and processes through the agency, making suggestions regarding effective problem solving and techniques, and then role-playing difficult conversations and serving as someone who can provide feedback for those difficult conversations. And then discussing what to do next. So I've done X, Y, and Z. What should I do next? And really having a discussion about what the possibilities are. And then facilitation, helping the parties explore differences. So we move from individual utilization of the service to now working with 2 people or more in the facilitation process, which is helping those people engage in constructive dialogue, leading difficult conversations within teams and groups in the agency, promoting understanding, and also developing workable solutions for those issues. And then on to conciliation, again, more involvement with the groups, with the individuals, helping them clarify issues, doing maybe some shuttle diplomacy, building bridges, helping really build a framework for communicating more effectively in those areas. So it's the idea of restoring, repairing, and rebuilding relationships, and then offering creative solutions. And then finally, probably the most intensive work that the ombudsperson will do is exploring facts in a manner that ensures that parties understand each other and communicate better, really determining exactly what the problem is between parties, between groups, and helping them develop workable solutions moving forward, and then helping them memorialize whatever those solutions are so that everyone has the same framework on how to move forward with communication. So how do you engage the ombudsperson? We have a phone number, we have email, and we have a request form that we have created. And I think in order for us to keep the kind of data that we want to keep in this service, whether you reach me by email or phone, you will be directed to use the form, because that is our way of collecting the data that we'll need to explore. So I have made a promise to get back to whoever utilizes the services and sends an email or phone call or submits a request form, to get back to them within 2 business days. I'm available to meet virtually, of course, we all are, right? But I can also arrange for a space in person at one of the facilities. And then we are preparing an evaluation form so that following the use of the Ombudsman services, we can get feedback on how that experience was for users. And then the last slide is my contact information. This concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Welcome, certainly, to the agency.
Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yes, this is Board Member Jantz. I do have a question. Like President Nigro mentioned, welcome. I do look forward to being able to work with you. It sounds like you have a wonderful background, and it seems like you are potentially exactly what we're looking for. But what are you doing to become familiarized with issues or potential conflicts when it comes to the disabled population or different perspectives pertaining to our population?
So, and thank you for that question. Since my arrival, as I said, I've been meeting with agency leadership, and once we officially roll the program out, I'll have opportunities to engage the public. I'll kind of do a tour, if you will, of different community organizations, different departments, explaining the role of the Ombudsperson, and then getting a real sense for the need in those areas. And so this is all going to be kind of an exploration over the next several weeks. So I'm hoping that those issues will bubble to the surface, and I'll have a better idea of where some of the concerns are. Hopefully that answers your question.
In a way, I also want to make sure that you do take the time to recognize and understand the perspective of individuals with disabilities. I think that will be helpful in any sort of conflict resolution, especially when it comes to our agency and your program.
Absolutely, and I completely agree, and certainly if you have some suggestions and some avenues that I can explore along the way, I welcome those suggestions.
I'm sure Assistant Superintendent Martin can fill you in on some of these suggestions that I sent his way.
Perfect.
Any other questions?
I just have one quick question. Thank you, President Nigro, and joining others and welcoming you. We're really excited to have you on board. Just one quick question for you. You spoke about getting the program up off the ground and beginning to engage the community. What is the timeline going to be like to get kind of up and running and begin to service folks that need to come to you? And then when can the board expect to start to receive information about kind of the outcome of some of the different trends that are being seen?
Well, technically, and from an infrastructure standpoint, we're ready now. So we have the processes in place, we have the paperwork in place, and so as we begin to make these introductions and more public introductions, we can open the program immediately. In terms of my reporting about the data that we're receiving, it really depends on how busy I am. I mean, I think I should probably wait until I have something of value to share, but I anticipate at least reporting out quarterly to the board on the progress of the program.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And maybe just one quick follow-up question to that as well. What is the kind of communication strategy to let folks know that the program is going to be available?
So I'm working with Superintendent Reichman and the assistant superintendents on that rollout, and so it's a work in progress, but we're going to blast it as far and wide as we can because we do believe that it will be a valuable service to the agency and the outside community.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
This is Duque. I'm not sure if the question, make sure, right?
Suke, you seem to be cutting out there a little bit.
If people could just to identify themselves.
Suke, are you still there?
This is Duque.
Oh, okay.
Here.
Okay, great. So you cut out a little bit there, but I think the message that we heard was that you would like us to, this is David, you'd like us to identify ourselves prior to speaking, correct?
Yes, I don't know who that.
Understood. That was Board Member Wonders just now. But we will be sure to identify ourselves. Again, this is David. If no other questions, we'll go to 7.04.
This is Superintendent Reichman.
Oh, sure.
I wanted to take this moment to interrupt. I do think we need to go back to 6.01 and 6.02. Those two were removed from the consent agenda.
They were not removed. No one seconded the motion to remove them, and I move that we accept the consent agenda.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. So now we can go to 7.04, a review of open meeting law on recording minutes pursuant to ARS 3843.1.03A3. The board may vote to go into executive session, which will not be open to the public, for discussion, consultation, for legal advice with the board's attorneys as it relates to this item. And now that we're in that, I'd like to move that we go into executive session pursuant to ARS 3843.1.03A3 for discussion, consultation, and legal advice from our attorneys. Is there a second?
This is Lynn. I second.
All in favor? Say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions?
This is PV. I abstain.
Okay, great. So we can go into the executive session now. There is the admonition that, well, for lack of a better term, Suke, do you have that?
I do. All persons present hereby reminded that it is unlawful to disclose or otherwise divulge a person who is not now present other than a current member of the ASDB board or pursuant to a specific statute section, anything that has transpired or has been discussed during this executive session. Failure to comply is a violation of ARS 38-41.03.
Thank you, Suke. The board is going to go to the executive session room.
Do I need to dial back?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think they can
Okay.
handle. I think they can do it.
Okay, I'll hold.
All right. Thank you. Okay, everyone, are we all back? Interpreters, do you need a break? It's coming up on 7. Do you guys? Okay, no?
Thank you, President Nigro, but the interpreters were able to rotate through breaks during the executive session.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, 8.01, call to the public on non-agendized items. Letitia, I don't believe we've gotten any papers before, and then there were no comments that were sent in prior. So we can go to 8.02, discussion and possible action item, agenda items for the next regular board meeting scheduled on November 10th in Phoenix, and proposed work study date on the strategic plan. Reminder, October 20th is the work study for the master facility plan. So October 20th is the work study for the master facility plan. I highly encourage everyone to attend. It's a very important issue for the agency, going forward. And I think over the next months and year, that's going to be really important to get that work done. It looked like in a doodle poll that we did prior to the meeting, it looked like February 9th was the date that worked best for, I think, 8 out of the 9 of us. So that had the most yeses. And that's going to be February 9th to talk about the kind of the update. As Board Member Bove mentioned at our last meeting, it's going to look at the strategic plan, the progress that we've made in that first fiscal year. We've already identified in our last meeting the areas where improvement is going to be made. That's one of the reasons we have the strategic plan. So we know and we've commented on where the improvement needs to be. That meeting is going to be to talk about the efforts that have been going on this semester and that are ongoing throughout the year to seek improvement in those metrics, as well as other metrics where we've, that we're also measuring. So we're going to talk about what we're doing to improve that and the different tactics that we're taking. Again, the strategic plan is the way that we know when we're there, and if we see that some lack of progress or regression in some cases, we're going to task the staff with working on that. So that's February 9th. We'll have to have a motion we might as well have a motion now to approve that. So I move that we accept February 9th, 2023 as a work study session on the strategic plan. Is there a second?
This is Lynn.
This is UK.
PV Joe.
Okay.
This is PV, I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay. And then for 802, are there any agenda items that you guys would like to see for the next meeting in November? There is, Brittany?
Yeah, I would like to look at maybe examining a new policy for meeting when we have a call to the public and they come up to the podium, maybe extending the amount of time that people that need interpretation services.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to do that this meeting. There just weren't any, so it's president's discretion for the time.
It is. Okay.
And we talked about that, I think last meeting, there was an issue that came up. So I was going to do 3 minutes for oral speaking and 4 minutes for people that use sign language or ASL, and go from there, and then keep the 500-word limit for things that are emailed in.
Have you asked a person that uses interpretation services if 4 minutes would be sufficient for them?
I spoke to a board member last time, but I guess I can do that. I can put that on my agenda for before the next meeting, because it is, so 4 minutes or 4.5 minutes, whatever that is, that's okay with me.
Okay.
Yeah, we just didn't have any any comments today. Are there any others? Okay, great. So moving on, we're going to go to 9.01, action item adjournment.
This is Lynn. I move that we adjourn this meeting.
I second. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, we'll see you guys in November. Thank you so much. I appreciate it again to the media and the staff and the interpreters. Thank you again for all of your hard work and for being back in person. We have these great new lights. They're amazing. Thank you.